Today, we will present to you about 4 jurisdictions in Federal Constitution by Group 2. Before we begin, let me introduce you our group presenters. Start with Nur Anis Najwa binti Muhammad Sukarnain. Next, which is me, Sayyidatun Nadira binti Shazali, and followed by Nurul Ain binti Musa. Next, we move on to the 4th presenter in this group, which is Nur Fatini Zati binti Muhammad Al-Husaini, and lastly is Nur Ain Farhana binti Yusli. The contents of this presentation are Introduction, External Affairs, Defense of the Federation, Internal Security, Education, and lastly, Conclusion. This presentation will begin with Introduction by Nur Anis Najwa and followed by the other group members.
Introduction. The state's highest law in the Constitution, which was first introduced as the Constitution of Federation of Malaya on Merdeka Day, which is 31 August 1957, and subsequently introduced as the Constitution of Malaya on Malaysia Day, 16 September 1963. One of the justifications for why the Constitution is considered as supreme law is on the ground that the Constitution is definitely not a custom-based regulation. It was founded right off the bat, and it has an incorporability as it made another establishment. The Constitution overshadows the Parliament and furthermore, the wellspring of every single administrative power. This implies that Parliament can't pass a law that disregards the Constitution. Subsequently, both the court and the public authority should guarantee that their activities are protected, and the Parliament can only carry out its tasks within the framework of the Constitution. After all, federalism in Malaysia is designated by the Constitution as a method used by the government to allow 2 or more entities to share control over the same geographic region. This means that the power is divided between the national government and the other government units, or also known as the division of power. This method was a way to have more powerful central government, but also a way to maintain the strength of the states and prevent the abuse of it. In Malaysia, for example, the power is divided into 3 parts of region, which is the first one, federal government in Putrajaya, state government, for instance Sabah, and lastly local government such as Sandakan Municipal Council. Most importantly, each person in Malaysian society is subject to the laws of the city, states, and our federal government. Hence, the 9th schedule to the Federal Constitution sets out federal and state lists containing the subject on which the federal and the state's government need to legislate and distribute the power. In addition, there is also concurrent list of subjects on which both federal and state's government also need to legislate. These lists are produced as following. List 1, which is federal list, contain 27 jurisdictions. List 2, focus on state list, have 12 jurisdictions. And lastly, list 3, that concurrent list carry out 18 jurisdictions. This topic will be explained more by my group member, so I will pass to the next presenter.
The first jurisdiction, External Affairs. Based on the 9th schedule, this one federalist in the first jurisdiction is External Affairs. It highlights treaties, agreements, and conventions with other countries, and all matters that bring the Federation into relations with other countries. Furthermore, it also mentioned the implementation of treaties, agreements, and conventions with other countries. According to Article 74, viewed in conjunction with the Federalists, the Federal Parliament has the exclusive power to create legislation relating to external affairs, including treaties, agreements, and conventions, and to execute international treaties and make them effective domestically. Moreover, Article 39 of the Constitution states that the executive authority of the Federation shall be vested in the Yang di-Pertuan Agong and exercisable by him or by the Cabinet or any minister authorized by the Cabinet. Again, under Article 81, the Federation's administrative jurisdiction extends to all issues over which Parliament may pass legislation. The Federalist stipulates that foreign affairs, which includes treaties, accords, and conventions with other countries, are among the topics on which Parliament may pass legislation. Therefore, the Federation's executive authority stands to the negotiation and conclusion of treaties, agreements, and conventions with other countries. This issue has been reinforced by the case of the government of the state of Kelantan versus the government of the Federation of Malaya and Tunku Abdul Rahman Putra Al-Haj. In this case, Kelantan challenged the constitutionality of the Malaysia Agreement, which is an international treaty signed by the United Kingdom, the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak, and found it unconstitutional. The conclusion is that, in terms of treaties, Malaysian practice is guided by the doctrine of transformation. Even if the government, which is the executive, has ratified a treaty and the treaty binds the government under international law, the treaty has no legal impact domestically unless the legislature introduces legislation to give the treaty legal effect. The second jurisdiction, the defense of the Federation.
The next jurisdiction in the Federal Constitution is the defense of Federation. The meaning behind defense of the Federation is the organization of a country's armies and weapons that used to protect the country or its interests. It includes any armed force affiliated with operating any federal armed force. For instance, the Navy, Army, and Air Force as well as the Armed Force. The defense of Federation is in the List 1, which is under the Federal List. Parliament can enact a law under this area because in Article 74(1) of the Federal Constitution, it states that Parliament may make law with respect to any of the matter enumerated in the Federal List or the concurrent list. Next, the federal government has jurisdiction over national defense involving the military of any armed force joining or operating with any armed party of the federal force. This shows that the federal government has huge power over the defense of the federation. It creates a stronger federal government which can increase the stability and progress of the country. However, only Yang di-Pertuan Agong has executive power over the country because he is supreme commander of the armed force. In the exercise of his function under this constitution or federal law, where the Yang di-Pertuan Agong is to act in accordance with advice, on advice, or after considering advice. The Yang di-Pertuan Agong shall accept and act in accordance with such advice. Furthermore, war and peace are also an element included in the defense of the Federation. To maintain the peace of the country, Malaysia has taken action by avoiding the country from any negative element, including threats and the ideology of extremism to support the sustainable peace of the country. As we know, Malaysia is the country that is rich of ethnic, racial, and religious. The Malaysian government always takes a close look at multi-ethnic condition in the country and adopts a tolerant attitude toward ethnic and religious background. That approach actually plays well with human rights demand from people. It's also a responsibility of federal government to ensure the country in harmony. Now let's move to the last slide under the context of defense of the Federation, which is maneuvers. Military maneuvers is an act to unify the laws related to military maneuvers. Under Military Maneuvers Act 1983, the YDPA will hold consultation with the relevant state authority of the state to declare any areas as maneuvering ground. Under Section 3, Maneuvering ground means any land, sea, tidal water or shore declared for military maneuvers. Meanwhile, the firing ground means that any land, sea, tidal water or shore declared carrying out rifle practice, including any weapons on the ground, such as firing, bomb dropping from the aircraft nor from the sea.
The third jurisdiction, internal security.
On top of that, the next jurisdiction of the federal government is called internal security. The federal government is responsible for ensuring that internal security is guaranteed and always safe for the sake of the people in this country. Furthermore, one of many federal departments that lies under this jurisdiction is Royal Malaysia Police. They are a centralized entity that is tasked with everything, such as they vow in processing security intelligence, conduct prosecution, and apprehend all persons whom he is by law authorized to apprehend. Apart from that, their jurisdiction has been enshrined in the Constitution, where they were tasked to secure the national border and carry out the criminals investigation.
Besides that, there was a National Security Policy (NSP) created by National Security Council Act of 2016, which empowers the National Security Council to develop national security policies and plans. The NSP is offered as the primary strategy for dealing with the many security threats that have become more dynamic and sophisticated in recent years. The key tactic will be implemented through the NCP to guarantee that national core values are preserved, keeping Malaysia secure from all type of threat, both physical and non-physical, that may influence and corrupt people's mind. The NCP highlight the importance of preserving its sovereignty, national security, and public order while also taking into account both international threat and geopolitical climate at the regional and international levels. Therefore, one of them is natural security environment, for example, pandemics and infection illness such as COVID-19. Malaysia has made rapid progress in combating COVID-19 and the epidemic is now under control. Movement, limitation as well as economic efforts have been introduced to reduce the impact on Malaysian survival.
And the last jurisdiction, education.
Next, we will move on to education. It is undeniably that education plays a vital role in every nation. Seeing how important it is, education has been included in the 9th schedule of the Federal Constitution. In Malaysia, the education system contains 3 levels, which is primary, secondary, and tertiary education. The Education Act 1996 is the major legislation that governs the education sector in Malaysia. Today, Malaysia has 43 universities, 31 private university colleges, 9 international university branch campuses, and 414 private colleges. The body that in charge to control over the education sectors goes to the Ministry of Education, which is currently occupied by Datuk Dr. Muhammad Razi Jidin since 30 August 2021. The primary education in Malaysia is designed for pupils between the ages of 7 until 12, which also called Standard 1 until Standard 6. At Standard 6, they will sit for UPSR for their assessment. Yet recently, UPSR has been fully abolished by the Education Minister, Datuk Dr. Muhammad Razi Jidin, during the pandemic of COVID-19 in 2021. Next, for secondary education, it provided by the National Secondary Schools, which in Malay called SMK, Sekolah Menengah Kebangsaan. In this level, Malay languages are being used as an instructional medium, yet English is a required subject in every school. The students will be assessed in PT3 for Form 3, which also being abolished currently in 2022, and SPM for Form 5. For tertiary education, it involved the university, vocational and technical, training of teachers, registration and control of teachers, managers and schools, promotion of special studies and research, and lastly, scientific and literal societies. As a result in development of the higher education, Ministry of Education restructuring the system, which led to the new establishment of Ministry of Higher Education, MOHE, including the Department of Higher Education, Jabatan Pengajian Tinggi, on 27 March 2004. Not just that, MOHE also responsible for any government agencies that involve in higher education sector activities. For instance, Perbadanan Tabung Pendidikan Tinggi Nasional (PTPTN) and the Tunku Abdul Rahman Foundation, Yayasan Tunku Abdul Rahman. Last but not least, libraries, museums, ancient and historical monuments and records, and archaeological sites are also under the government jurisdiction, which stated in the 9th schedule of the Federal Constitution.
In conclusion, every level of government in Malaysia has its own jurisdiction that has been stated in the Federal Constitution, and these are a few jurisdictions that we have been discussed, and it is called External Affairs, Defence of the Federation, Internal Security, and Education. Firstly, the federal government has its own jurisdiction to handle the external affairs. Examples of external affairs matters are treaties, agreements, and conventions with other countries. By having all these agreements with other countries, it will give us a lot of advantages to Malaysia, especially in many aspects such as economy, social, and politics. Next, our federal government also has jurisdiction over the national defense. This is where the militaries of Malaysia Armed Forces are in charge to maintain and defend our national security in every part of Malaysia from the outside threats. This is because their power is vested in the Constitution in the supreme head of the Federation. Meanwhile, for the internal security, one of the federal departments that were given the jurisdiction is the Royal Malaysia Police. They are the centralized entity that works with everything from the traffic control to information collecting. Furthermore, they are ensuring in the constitution to secure the national border and security within this country. Finally, the last jurisdiction that we have been discussed is about education. The Ministry of Education has given the full responsibility to handle all the education matters starting from elementary school, secondary school, and university education in Malaysia. They are in charge to ensure that the quality of education in Malaysia is suitable for all Malaysia and well guaranteed.
That's all from us. Thank you for listening.